I'm, to some extent, a reluctant Brexiteer. I can see that the EU's done some very good things over the years, particularly drawing France and Germany together after the war. And I think that many of the social developments that have been in the EU have been to everybody's advantage. But I do think the EU has lost its way in some important respects recently, and in particular, I think it's made two huge mistakes. The first was getting the Eurozone established, which has led to very low rates of economic growth in Europe and high levels of unemployment. And the second, what I think was a really good idea, to bring in the countries in Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism. I think to have extended the free movement of people across the enormous economic gradient there is between West and Eastern Europe hasn't worked very well. And I think that's fueled a lot of the discontent there is, both in the UK and in other parts of the European Union, about the state of affairs in the EU. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk a bit about the economic effects of Brexit. But before that, I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time talking about what was promised by David Cameron at his Bloomberg speech and subsequently, and what's actually happened. Because I've been involved in the EU as an issue for a long time. Believe it or not, I was the national agent for the Out campaign in 1975, so I've been around for a long time on all this. And it's always seemed to me that there were advantages of Britain being in the EU, but these were outweighed by the disadvantages which it brought in trade. And I think a number of these are still there. Let me run very quickly through what these are before I come to the economic aspects. The first is that the EU is very expensive for the UK. It costs about £11.1 billion in the last years of accounts. If you include everything, that's the EU budget and all the various other bits and pieces that go with it. And £11.1 billion is less than 1% of GDP, that's absolutely true, but it's also about a third of the cost of primary and secondary education put together in this country, and a third of our defence expenditure. So it's a very large sum of money. The second is that I do think we've got a big problem about population growth in this country. And having extra people coming in, especially from Eastern, to some extent Southern Europe as well, is just exacerbating the problems that we've got. Our population is rising by about 550,000 people a year. And if you divide the total accumulated capital of the country, which is about $8.5 trillion, by the population, which is about 65 million, you find a figure of £130,000. So this means that what we ought to be doing is spending £130,000 times 550,000 every year just to stop our schools and roads and hospitals and housing getting diluted down. And we're spending nothing like that. The total we are spending is something like a third of that amount, and that's why we're under so much pressure on these social facilities. I think there are also real concerns by a lot of people about the way the EU has gone, with the high levels of unemployment, the way Greece has been treated, the way Spain's been treated, the imbalances in the EU, and these are matters which affect people in this country both directly and indirectly, and shade into the problems about democratic control in Europe. I think one of the real problems that the EU's got is this uncertainty, this inability that people feel they've got about how to control what it does, how to influence it. I mean, although all the countries that make up the EU are all democracies, the EU itself is really not very democratic. It was never even set up to that way. It was set up originally by Jean Monnet and his colleagues to be largely a technocratic organisation rather than a democratic one, and that's the way it's always been. But perhaps the biggest single problem of all is where the EU is going over the next few years. Now, there was a report that was produced and published called the Five Presidents' Report, which lays out what the leadership in the EU thinks is going to have to happen over the next 10 years or so, essentially to keep the Eurozone and the single currency in being. And really there's no alternative that the EU has got but to become much more federalist than it is at the moment, to go for banking union, monetary union, fiscal union, and eventually political union. It's the only way they're going to avoid the single currency breaking up. And I don't think that's what most people in this country want. And also, I don't think it's what most people in Europe want either. So there's this huge pull between where the democratic pressures are and where the economic pressures are pulling Europe. And I think that's a very major issue which may well, over the next 5 or 10 years, blow up in everybody's faces. So I don't think it's true that just staying in the EU is really necessarily a very safe option. It may turn out to be a very unsafe option. Now let me turn to the question of what's going to happen if there is Brexit to the economic community. Now you've heard some fearsome reports from all sorts of people, OECD, the Treasury, NIESR, and all the rest of them, about what might happen to the economy. I must say, I find this pretty implausible. I really don't see why there should be an enormous drop down. I do think it depends enormously on what sort of policies are pursued post-Brexit. If what happens is that the policies adopted are protectionist and ones which turn the country inwards rather than out for the world, I think it may well be that we run into a period of poor economic performance. But that's not really where I think we ought to be going. And there is an alternative economic case which has been put forward by some very respectable economists in this country and endorsed incidentally by Open Europe, who are themselves are very well informed but stand in the middle of all this, suggesting that if those sort of policies are implemented, far from the GDP in the UK going down as a result of Brexit, it ought to be considerably higher over the coming period, probably 2 or 3% initially, and then growing from that. But it does, as I say, depend enormously on the policies which are pursued. So how come that all the various organisations that you've read about produce such dire results? Actually, when you analyse them, what it all turns on is what assumptions you make which produce the outcome that results. And when you analyse all these reports, essentially all the ones that produce the dire results assumed that the economy was going to turn inwards, that there'd be less trade, and as a result of this, less welfare gains. And actually, if you reverse those assumptions, even using exactly the same models as those companies have used, you get the alternative result, which I've just described to you, which is doing a little better. So I think it may be the case that you will have some uncertainty over the coming period if we do come out. But frankly, I think the reality is that the risks to the British economy from Brexit are absolutely dwarfed by other risks that are coming in from other directions. And these are partly external risks, breakdown in Saudi Arabia, banks going bust in Italy, more trouble in Greece, difficulties in China on the one hand, and internal problems which we have in this country, very low rates of investment, big balance of payments problems, deindustrialization, rising debt, and so on. So I do think we live in uncertain economic times, that's for sure. But I also think that the effect of Brexit on all this, the chances of Brexit making the whole situation significantly worse rather than better really are very minimal. I don't see why customers that Britain's got abroad are going to stop buying from us just because we're not in the common market anymore. Incidentally, the EU, we don't need to be in the single market to trade with the European Union. We could be well outside it and still trade just as well. If, in fact, as a result of Brexit, we do finish up with any kind of a trade war with Europe, which I think is very unlikely. The industrial tariffs that we've got to overcome are only about 2.5% or something these days. So if the pound goes down by that amount, you're back where you started. And actually, if you are going to do anything about immigration, and there are some difficult choices to be made here, but there are also risks involved in staying. There are difficulties about the European Union, which are manifest and which will continue if we don't lead. There are long arguments that are often put forward saying that what we ought to do is to stay in because you're better to be able to get the problems resolved if you're inside than outside. I have to say, I think the renegotiation that was done by David Cameron with the very small amount that he brought back suggests that that's a pretty small chance of being successful, particularly against the background of the European Union moving in the opposite direction towards more federalism and more Europe, which is the economic situation there is going to drive it in. So my conclusion is that if we really want to get to where we want to be, and I'll tell you where I think the British people really do want to be with Europe. They want to be really friendly, they want free trade, they want loads and loads of cooperation, but they want that on an intergovernmental basis and not as part of a big political project. And I think that if we do vote for Brexit on the 23rd of June, we will then have to have a whole series of renegotiations. But the end state of that is much more likely to be what most people in this country, and indeed most people in Europe for that matter, really want. More cooperation, but less political control. More control over our own future. And that's why I think you should vote for out on the 23rd of June.